Welcome back to the workshop. I'm Bill. Let's talk about stoves. Now, I'm willing to bet these look familiar to pretty much everybody who's ever been camping. This is Coleman's green Suitcase stove, 2-burner. Came in all sorts of different variations over the years. They started making these in the 1930s. You can go down to Canadian Tire, you can buy one today. They're still around. In fact, the new ones you get today look almost just like this. Minor variations through the years. You can see them here. This is a Model 4H made at the Toronto factory, roughly 1938 to 1941. It's not quite the very beginning of the line. There was one before this, but it's close, moving back into the mid-30s. It's got actual bent wire legs. The windscreens are held in place by these little wavy wires. Whereas on these later models, I think the American ones still have legs on them, but this is a Model 421D from 1976. This was almost the very last model they made like this in Toronto before switching to the Easy Lights. But that's another video that I hope to make sometime soon. It's got little bump outs pressed into the bottom of the case instead of legs. It's got different retainers for the windscreens. Instead of the legs holding the lid down, this has an actual latch. A little bit easier to work with. This has a hinged grate. It was the only one of the 421 series that did. Some of the things are a little more noticeable. I pulled out this 4H because you'll notice it actually has a one-piece cast iron burner. The old models were like that prior to World War II, whereas the 421D has a burner made out of 2 pieces of stamped steel that are crimped together. But they serve the same function, they work the same way. Probably the most notable feature, and when I talk to other collectors or people who are looking for something vintage, everybody wants these old round tanks. They used these in the US until about 1960 and in Canada up until about 1965, and then they transitioned to these red torpedo tanks. The torpedo tanks are made of steel, 2 pieces, they're stamped and then crimped together, whereas these old tanks in the early days, they were either brass on the less expensive models or steel alloy. Coleman called it Everdur, that was meant to be rust resistant on the higher end models, and then I think by the late 40s they were doing the Everdur only. You can usually tell the brass ones because they dent very easily and they're usually pretty beat up. But despite how different these look, they work exactly the same way. And the valves, even though there are slight variations in the shape, for example, this bit here that you can fit a wrench on, this is a lot easier to work with than these older tapered ones, but the valves work exactly the same way too. The generators are mostly interchangeable, and in fact even these tanks can be switched from one unit to the other. They all work the same way. So we're going to look at these today and look at theory of operation, because if you've got a problem, if you need to troubleshoot, you need to have that understanding of how it works. So you can trace the problem, so you can isolate it. And just like the lanterns we looked at in the previous videos, these are instant lighting. That means they run on gasoline, and they have a system that leverages gasoline's low boiling point of 98 degrees Celsius, so that you can light it without having to preheat it and without having a big flare-up, without flooding it. Now that doesn't mean people don't flood these all the time, and I hope as we go through the theory of operation that you'll see how to prevent it from flooding and why that sort of thing happens when you're trying to light it improperly. So first, we're going to talk about how they work. What do you need for a fire? You need some kind of fuel, you need air. And you've got to have those two in the right combination. And these Coleman stoves are designed, they're engineered to provide that fuel and air combination first so that it can light easily without making a big fireball, and then once it settles down so that you have optimal burning, so you've got good heat to cook with. So fuel, these run on gasoline. They're designed to run on white gas or naphtha, so often sold under brand names like Coleman Fuel. It's unleaded but without all the additives you find in pump gas. These will run just fine on unleaded gasoline. In fact, in the last few decades, Coleman has made versions of these Suitcase stoves as well as their little single burner stoves and lanterns as well, that run on unleaded gasoline. They're usually painted in a silver and black livery, and they're advertised as dual fuel. It's a little bit of an advertising or marketing gimmick because all of these can run on unleaded, they can do it safely. It doesn't seem to be an issue when it comes to food because there's nothing in those dual fuel models that captures anything that would be in pump gas that wasn't in Coleman fuel or naphtha. The difference between those dual fuel stoves and these is that the generators are a bit larger. What happens as you use these is carbon and crud builds up inside the generator and eventually needs to be replaced, or I'll show you in another video, you should never have to replace a generator. They can be cleaned out fairly easily. Saves a lot of money. The dual fuel models simply have a bigger generator so they can tolerate more buildup. Other than that, they're exactly the same. So these can run on unleaded if you want to do it that way. It's certainly cheaper, but if you need to run it in a place indoors, for example, you may find the fumes from the pump gas. It smells worse than white gas does. So fuel goes in the tank. This or this. So let's take the tank off. In both cases, they mount with these tabs here and here. On later models, if you're curious about dating, in the early 60s they started stamping dates on them. On the cylindrical tanks, the date is usually stamped on one of these tabs near the where it welds on. On the torpedo tanks, it's usually stamped either on the top or bottom of one of these tabs, and you'll have something like this has, I think, a 3 and a 76, and this might have, say, a 1 and a 63, although this predates the dating scheme. So on both of these, you've got similar filler caps. You unscrew it, you pour the gas in, there's a rubber seal in there so that it doesn't lose pressure. Pour the gas in here, we fill it up. Now one thing you'll notice, and you probably won't be able to see this on the camera, in fact I know you can't because I can barely see it if I put a flashlight in there, but below this filler opening there's a tube or a baffle. It actually extends down into the tank roughly 3.5 inches. So it extends down this far. So when you set this tank down and you start pouring fuel in here, and by the way, it's important to use a funnel with a filter in it. You don't want impurities or sediment getting into your tank. That can clog the generator, it can impede the combustion process if it clogs the gas jet. But you pour the gas in here, you can only pour it up to the bottom of that baffle. Once it gets there, then it starts filling up the tube and will run out the top. The reason for that baffle is that you need to have a space for air inside the tank. Now, this accomplishes the same thing by having this is more like a lantern fount in this sense. The fuel opening is situated lower. Notice you can only fill this that full with fuel. One thing you don't want to do, and I've seen people do it out in campgrounds, they want to make sure they don't have to refill their tank quite so often, so they'll do this. They'll take the cap off, and they'll sit it at an angle and pour the fuel in this way so that they can get it up to about here. If you do that, well, one, if you happen to set it horizontally and unscrew the fuel cap, fuel will go everywhere, and you don't want that. But secondly, it doesn't leave enough room to pump air into it. Because somehow the fuel in the tank needs to come out through this generator, or through this valve into the generator. The way we do that is with this pump. If this is familiar to everybody, you turn it anti-clockwise a couple of turns, put your thumb over the hole, you pump it. When you've got enough pressure in there, you turn it clockwise. That closes it up. Now it's pressurized. If you open this valve, you'll get a spurt of fuel out that gas tip. That goes into the manifold here. We'll get to that in a bit. But what's going on behind here? If we were to take this out, what's inside? Well, if we take the clip off and pull the cover off, what we find is something like this inside. It's exactly the same as what you'll find in the lanterns. This has a tube that's about that long that runs back into the tank. It's got a slight angle on it. And at the back end of it, there's a little air tube that runs straight up. That ensures that the air that you pump down into this tube gets delivered to that airspace in the top of the tank. It also ensures, this is why you don't want to overfill it, it ensures that the one point where something could feed back through the pump tube is above the fuel level. Otherwise, you could end up with gasoline leaking back down, potentially through the check valve into the pump and out through the end. So down at the bottom of that tube is a check valve. This is the first defense against air that you pump in leaking back out. Looks just like this. It threads into the bottom very tightly. You need a special tool to remove these. I know it's got a slot that looks like you could put a screwdriver in there, and you can, but if you try to take it out that way, chances are it'll slip and you'll end up rounding this out, and then it's a real bear to get out. So get the right tool. That's another video. This check valve sits in the bottom. It's got a little ball bearing inside. You can hear it rattle when you shake it, or you should. If it doesn't move, that means, or if you don't hear the rattle, that means it's stuck and needs to be serviced. But as you pump pressure in, the back pressure closes that check valve by pushing on the ball bearing. The second line of defense against leakage is this air stem, and you see it threads in. It's got a pointed tip that seals down where that ball bearing is, and if it's working right, that ensures you don't have air leaking out either. So you've got a two-step seal on that. So this air stem is what you see sticking out of that tube if you were to pull the pump out. The pump goes into that tube and it slides up and down that air stem. When you go to open it to pump air in and turn it anti-clockwise a couple of times, what it's doing is turning that air stem. Down here at the base on the pump is hollow and it's crimped, so it sort of makes a square, and that square grabs the air stem to turn it. So when you turn the pump this way, you turn the air stem and unlock it. When you turn it the other way, it threads down and it seals it into the check valve. The most important part of the pump is the leather cup. This one's brand new, so it's never seen any oil, but normally it's permeated with oil. That oil keeps it soft and flexible. That oil also ensures that it makes a nice seal against the walls of the pump tube. So when you pull this out, the leather compresses just a little bit, and it allows air to rush down in to fill the void below it in the pump tube. And then when you push down on it with your thumb over that little hole, sealing it up, and you push down, the leather wants to flare out. It makes a nice seal against the walls of the tube, and it pushes the air down through the check valve and into the fount, or into the tank. So you do that about 30 times, maybe 40 on some of the stoves with larger tanks. There are larger versions of these, the 444 up here and the 413 in the States, very similar. They work exactly the same way, just everything's bigger. And there are 3-burner versions as well. There's the 446 up here and the 426 down in the States. They're basically stretch models of the standard Suitcase stove. In fact, up here we had a stretch model of the 4M, which was somewhere in between here in the late 50s and early 60s. All they did was extend it and add a 3rd burner. So we pump about 30 strokes in there. If the tank's full, that should be enough. Now we're ready to light. So how does the fuel get to the ignition point? When you light it, you hold the match to this burner, the primary burner. Don't light the auxiliary, that'll come later. You have to light the primary burner, which is the one the generator runs over. Put this on. There's a reason for that. You'll find on 3-burner stoves, the primary is in the middle, and there would be another auxiliary over here. So what happens? You've got this valve. The fuel comes up out of the tank, through the valve, into the generator, and hits the manifold. This is where it mixes with air. But the fuel is liquid at this point. If we were to just open the valve and light it, and some of the older pre-Instant-Lite stoves are like this, you'd end up with a big fireball. Because you just have liquid fuel, it's not vaporized, it floods the stove. You've probably had that happen if you were inexperienced trying to light one of these. Well, that's where the Instant-Lite circuit comes in. I remember as a kid, and I know so many people have mentioned this, everybody remembers these little levers. And on the top of the tank, it's got a note that says, turn up to light and wait 60 seconds while it burns. And you'll remember there was a red flame, and sometimes it could get fairly large. Once it calms down and it turns to blue, then you turn it down, and you add a few more pumps of air if necessary, but then you've got a nice blue flame there. Here's what that's doing. This is the Instant-Lite. So here's a valve. This is from an American 425 stove, probably from the 80s. It's exactly the same in terms of how they work. In fact, most of these parts are all interchangeable. Here's what happens. This is that lever in the down position. This is the hole where the fuel enters the system on the bottom of the fuel pickup. We'll see what happens as we turn this. Get our light back. Hopefully you can see as we turn that, it pushes a little wire through the hole. Now the hole is blocked. We turn it down, the wire retracts, and the hole is open. Here's what's happening. This lever pulls and pushes this air wire up and down. We may have seen that we saw this on the lanterns. On those, it's a spring-loaded deal that's held in place by the valve stem. On these, it's captive, so it doesn't come out. You don't want it will come out. You don't want that to happen. What this is doing, again, it's opening and closing the fuel pickup. But this isn't just a simple tube. This is the fuel and air tube. And what it is, it's a tube within a tube. You can see an outer tube here. If you look through this hole, this is where air enters. There's another tube inside. So that the outer tube is here. Down at the bottom, there's a gap, and then the inner tube runs up and feeds the fuel out and up into the valve here. And that air tube, or air wire, runs through the middle. So what happens? When the air wire is blocking that hole, it doesn't block it entirely. The air pressure in the fount will push just a little bit of fuel through there, a very little bit. So when you open the valve on the lanterns, it's a quarter turn. On these, it can go more. You don't want to open it all the way at this point usually. But when you open the valve now, there's a path for the pressure in the tank to try to escape. Because it can't do that by pushing the fuel up through the fuel intake, instead, the air that's in the top of the fount rushes in this hole, down the outer tube, and up the inner tube to the valve and out through the generator and the gas tip. In the process, at the bottom here, it picks up that little bit of fuel, and that little bit of fuel makes droplets in the airflow. So as the air flows up, it carries that fuel through the valve and into the generator and out the gas tip. When you put a match to the burner, it ignites. Now it does make a flame. It does flare. It's not the neatly controlled blue flame you want to cook with. But it doesn't flood the stove. There's not enough fuel to do that. What there is just enough fuel to make a flame that's just big enough to heat up the generator. And the generator doesn't have to get very hot. Again, 98 degrees Celsius. When it reaches that point, then that liquid fuel inside the generator turns to vapor. It expands many times its original liquid size, builds up pressure, and you end up getting a nice stream of vaporized gasoline coming out of the gas jet. At that point, you end up with the nice controlled blue flame as it's mixing with air properly from the manifold. You can turn that lever down. It opens the fuel valve, or it opens the fuel pickup all the way, and you're ready to run. Now the generator, normally they're not this easy to unscrew. If you were to take this off, you'll see this screws into the back end of the valve stem. There's a cleaning needle, just like on the lantern generators. It's got a little sharp needle on the end. Don't poke yourself on that. And this is activated when you open and close the knob. It rotates and it pushes the needle. When you close the valve, it pushes the needle out When you open the valve, it retracts the needle. What that does is it moves the needle back and forth through the generator tube, and it pokes through this gas tip on the end. That cleans the tip out so it doesn't get clogged with carbon, because these stove generators will clog up much more easily than the lantern generators will. And then, like the lantern generators, inside this tube is a steel spring that helps keep this centered, but it also helps regulate the heat and the flow of fuel. So this guy gets hot, the liquid gas turns to vapor, and it comes out through this jet in the tip. Now, that's the first half of our combustion components. I said we need fuel, we need oxygen. Where does the oxygen come from? Well, it's all around us. The generator enters this cast iron manifold at this point, and we can't see it, but if I put my finger under here, I can actually stick my finger up inside that manifold. On this model, it's open on the bottom. That's where the oxygen comes from. As the fuel blasts in there, that jet of vaporized gas jets into the manifold, it draws the oxygen with it right up through here. All the burners are a little bit different in this regard, but they work the same way. On this stamped steel burner, you can't see it, but there's just a little hole on either side, and that draws in the air. The air and fuel mix. They run around through this U-shaped mixing chamber or manifold. It comes under this primary burner, and it comes out through the burner rings here. On some older stoves, they just had steel plates here that had little standoffs so that you had gaps and the flame would shoot out through those. In the 1930s, Coleman came out with this technology. They use alternating steel rings. So there's a flat one and then there's a corrugated one, and a flat one and a corrugated one. They called it band of blue, and they make a really nice, steady, even blue flame around these burner caps. So that heats up the generator. It keeps the generator hot so the stove keeps running properly. Then, once the primary burner is lit and it's running well and the gas is vaporizing, then you can open the secondary valve, or the secondary burner with this valve here. All this does, it's a plate on a screw that seals off the flow of air and fuel in the manifold here. So as you unscrew this, it backs off that plate, and it opens the second valve for fuel. So I think that's everything as far as how it works for now. So let's see how these run once we light it. So let's pump this up. We'll do 30 strokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. Seal that valve closed. Right, so we've changed camera angles so you can see what's going on here. We've got it full of air, it's pumped up. Now we're ready to light. So we'll turn that lighting lever up, which pushes the air wire down into the fuel pickup. The Instant-Lite circuit's ready to go. Light a match, we'll put it to the burner, we'll open the fuel valve. You see this good flame to start with. That'll settle down once the burner starts heating up. And as it settles down and you see that blue flame around the burner rings, that's what we're looking for. We'll let it run a bit longer. Some stoves take longer. This stove runs beautifully, and it often settles down within 15 to 20 seconds. Most stoves will take around 30, some will take as long as a minute. Let it run that way. And once it settles down, still not quite there. Alright, that looks good. We'll go ahead and turn this down. We can add a bit more air pressure to it. Now that's running nice. You can see that nice blue ring of flame around there. Now, if the fuel's vaporizing properly, we're ready to light the secondary burner. I don't like to waste matches. So there we go. Got both burners running. Put the grate back in place. Now note, both burners are still controlled by this main valve. So you turn it down, they both go down. You turn it up, they both go up. Opening the auxiliary valve routes about 40% of the gas over there. So if you're cooking, remember that when you close the auxiliary valve, this is going to get a lot bigger. You could burn something that way, or if you've got a large pan on there, you may end up scorching your paint because flames go out around the bottom of the pan and hit the sides here. We'll turn that down. And now we'll go ahead and shut it off. Really simple. Just turn the valve clockwise until it's closed. Won't turn anymore. So it's dying. You may see the flame take a few minutes to die down and to go out. Be aware of that. These generators are fairly big and they hold a lot of fuel. And it all needs to burn out before the flame is finally gone. Be aware of that so you don't accidentally set something on fire, not realizing the flame's out. Also, another thing to be aware of is if you're getting ready to pack up, this stays hot for quite a while. So if you put it in the air screens and fold the lid down, you may end up with scorched paint, or on these models from the 60s onward that have these plastic decals, you may end up with melted plastic inside there. I see a lot of these stoves with melted plastic on the inside of the lid. But that's it. I hope this helps you enjoy your Coleman stove. Hopefully we'll do some more videos another time, maybe showing some 3 burners, showing the later Canadian 431 series, which looks very much like this, but has some unique features of its own, different style valve. And I'd like to show you some earlier hot blast stoves before they instituted this Instant-Lite feature. There you get a nice big flame while it preheats. Those are neat to watch. But for now, I hope this helps. If you have problems, I hope this helps you isolate your problem. I also hope it helps you if you go camping and put it into use so you don't have flare-ups or flooding or anything like that. Thanks for watching.